Tonight's program, tonight's Nature Speaks, we welcome Dr. Dan Shilling, author and historian all the way from Phoenix, Arizona. His program tonight is Aldo Leopold Listens to the Southwest. Welcome, Dan.
Welcome. Is my sound okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody, or evening, wherever you are. And I want to thank Dana and Terry and everybody at Prospect Heights and the library for this invitation to speak to you today, especially on Earth Day. This presentation is all slides, so you don't need to look at me. I'll begin with this. Maybe not, Terry, it's not advancing.
Is that the sound that I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's me trying to advance it.
All right.
Yeah, the title of this talk is Aldo Leopold Listens to the Southwest. And so what I want to do is discuss the environment, both the natural and the cultural environment that Leopold stepped into when he arrived here in the Southwest in 1909, that helped to shape his thinking about the land, especially at the beginning of his career. The political and racial and gender views of early environmentalists like John Muir are much in the news these days. So that provides yet another reason to examine Leopold's cultural makeup. I'll begin with this quote from a letter that the 17-year-old Aldo sent home from his boarding school in New Jersey after listening to Charles Eastman, who was a well-known and a prominent Native American elder and physician who had just spoken to Leopold's class. Referring to Eastman, Aldo writes, he said, after speaking of the Indians' knowledge of nature, nature is the great mystery. The words are simple enough, but the meaning unfathomable. The serious people, other people, have struggled with this unfathomable meaning, and they continue to do so. As this quote, as this slide foreshadows, few people would wrestle more eloquently with that elusive meaning than Aldo Leopold. A key figure in environmental history, Leopold came here to Arizona in 1909. At the start, it's worth remembering something about the natural and political and cultural universe he stepped into. Before going any further, I'll just point out that the research for this presentation developed over 3 National Endowment for the Humanities summer institutes, month-long summer institutes for college professors that I co-directed for Arizona State. They began in 2009, the centennial of Leopold's arrival in the Southwest, and the students included professors who teach environmental philosophy, land management, Native American studies, nature writing, green architecture, sustainability, ecology, and related studies. Certainly, Leopold stretches across the curriculum. With each institute, some of us saw more clearly the indigenous character of Leopold's philosophy, and that eventually led to this. What's going on? To this publication, Traditional Ecological Knowledge, published by Cambridge in 2008, which suggests how the modern world can learn from native ecological practices. Leopold, I think, did something similar, even if the discipline TEK did not exist, and even if we find no statement where Leopold says, this is what I learned from Indian people. Still, he absorbed a great deal from his environment, which was shaped at the time by Mexican and native land practices, and his evolving views frequently emerge in the TEK book. An Iowan whose career played out in the Southwest and the Midwest, Leopold is remembered for many contributions. A founding member of the Wilderness Society, the originator of game management, the architect of what we would today call wilderness areas, a critic of DDT 20 years before Rachel Carson, an early practitioner of land cooperatives, and well ahead of his time, an activist who suggested boycotting products made with child labor or in an environmentally harmful manner. Moreover, Leopold is remembered as the author of hundreds of technical articles, but what he's most remembered for is the Sand County Almanac, the book that launched environmental ethics in the 1970s, more than 2 decades after his death in 1948. Leopold was, of course, no trained philosopher. Educated as a forester at Yale, when Gifford Pinchot's utilitarian creed dominated conservation policy, Leopold arrived in Arizona in 1909 to begin his career in the brand new Apache National Forest, whose boundaries had been drawn just a year before he arrived. Part of his job was to survey the more than 2 million square miles that stretched across Arizona and New Mexico. That first year, he probably never passed up an opportunity to shoot a predator, especially a wolf. But after one such incident, he sensed a disconnect between his classroom training and this hillside lesson, which he'd write about 35 years later. It's worth reflecting on those words. We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I realized then, and have known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain. He continues, I was young then and full of trigger itch. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean a hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. In other words, the mountain thinks. There is, so does the wolf. And there is, he says, between them, something known only to them. Where are humans in this dialogue? Asked Leopold in this 1944 essay, a landmark statement in nature writing and a pivotal episode in a Sand County Almanac. He had shot the wolf south of Springerville in northeastern Arizona. Here's the spot. If you'd like to know how we know this, because for years people wondered if the events Leopold describes in his essay actually happened, we can talk about that in the Q&A. Shooting the wolf was a routine act since the Forest Service's eradication policy held that fewer predators benefited ranchers and hunters. But the ebbing green fire planted a thought Leopold didn't grasp, let alone express, for decades, that nature's logic, what he called mountain thinking, regulated the hillside just fine. In that mountain moment, Leopold sensed at least some of that unfathomable meaning and eventually became a powerful voice for stewardship, speaking, honoring and protecting for what he called all the cogs and wheels. It's an understanding crystallized in the land ethic, his book's capstone essay. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. Importantly, Leopold understood that no one person can compose an ethic. Nothing so important as an ethic is ever written. It must be a collective, evolving effort, as he says, in the minds of a thinking community. Leopold's own career reflects this changing, evolving attitude about our relationship to nature. His land ethic certainly breaks with what earlier philosophers believed about the human-nature bond, what manifest destiny decreed, what utilitarianism endorsed, or what many felt the Bible sanctioned. But the core of his ethic was not new. He may have dressed it in modern scientific garb, but the underlying moral tone he adopts would have been familiar to earlier cultures. Leopold's long transition from a young forest manager to an environmental sage parallels the nation's passage from unapologetic exploitation to a more aware brand of conservation. Historic Roderick Nash is justly celebrated for his monumental environmental history, Wilderness and the American Mind, but his book, The Rights of Nature, which traces the evolution of humankind's philosophical relationship to the land, presents Leopold as an evolving figure. When we consider the tools that nurtured his development, clearly his familiarity with conservation research played a role. As Rod Nash and others point out, equally important was Leopold's appreciation of history and philosophy and other cultural leanings that pepper his prose. As consequential and perhaps too often overlooked was the cultural heritage of the Southwest that he stepped into. Leopold wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but compared to many at the end of the 19th century, his childhood was very comfortable. With a view of the river and the railroad, which had turned Burlington into a transportation hub, Aldo no doubt saw countless trees and other natural resources pass through town. A bird watcher, artist, and note taker from a very early age, with the surrounding hills as backdrops, Aldo's childhood was filled with outdoor passions instilled by his father, an avid hunter, who passed on a strong ethical code to his son. Education was likewise valued, and to expand their son's horizon, his parents sent Aldo to an academy in New Jersey when he was 17. Then they provided for 4 years at Yale, where he graduated from Pinchot's Young Forestry program. During the holidays, he might escape with his family to a new national park or vacation at a boating community on the Great Lakes. However, his comfortable lifestyle was about to change. Leopold would live through some of the most momentous periods in the history of land management policymaking. And importantly, he lived in places where these policies were stark and consequential. As this slide shows, during Leopold's 40-year career, he witnessed the birth of federal land agencies, the passage of new environmental laws, the popularization of the outdoors, a surge in nature-based literature, and New Deal activities on the land. An early graduate of Yale's forestry school, he would go on to create some of the first college programs that taught conservation holistically, breaking down barriers between disciplines. Also, the 20th century was framed by the conservation-preservation debate, captured in the expressions of Pinchot and Muir, both friends of Leopold's hero, Theodore Roosevelt, and spotlighted in the battle to dam Hetch Hetchy, the first national environmental debate. That's the reservoir created by the dam in the photo. Muir lost the battle to save his treasured valley in 1913 and was dead within a year. Now, it's commonplace to say that Leopold was a student of Pinchot's wise use approach and ended a disciple of the preservationist Muir. While there are problems with that statement, since it oversimplifies all of their positions, it's a fair starting point. Certainly, Leopold begins in Pinchot's classroom, but while he will eventually echo Muir's passion, his land ethic is more nuanced. He realizes not everybody can live alone in the Sierra Nevada like John Muir. He celebrates a third way, today's radical center, where use and preservation intersect. At the University of Wisconsin, he encouraged students to appreciate, quote, the beauty as well as the utility of the whole. In his game management, which remained for decades the textbook for conservation, Leopold was already contemplating an alternative. There is a third minority who denies kitchens or factories need be ugly or farms lifeless in order to be efficient. From where did this third way spring? He drew from many sources, but to find one, look west and then south to a fragile yet unforgiving landscape, and then look to the cultures who had sustained themselves there for thousands of years. Listen to the narratives of the Southwest cultural geography. Aldo Leopold listened. On a summer's day in 1909, with a master's degree from Yale in hand, the 22-year-old Iowan stepped from the train at Holbrook, Arizona. If his Tom Mix attire seemed amateurish, so too was Leopold's initial field work in Apache National Forest. More than a few colleagues questioned the new man's skills, especially after he botched his first major assignment, but soon he proved himself and advanced, only to suffer a kidney ailment in 1913 that nearly killed him. Alone on a mountain, a day's ride from home, Leopold's life, his journal suggests, may have been saved by an Indian. It was an ordeal that would curb his field work. From now on, he'd be a desk jockey, an administrator, an investigator, working in government and public relations. When he arrived, Holbrook was a trading post for the Navajo Reservation and a gateway to petrified forest, a new national monument. Founded in 1881, when the railroad reached Arizona and named for an engineer, Holbrook was home to about 600 people, most eking out a living as ranchers. Nearby Springerville, where Leopold worked for a short time, was a smaller community of about 300, mostly Mormons, whose novel religion introduced yet another land ethic to Rim country. Still 3 years from statehood, Arizona was home to only about 200,000 people in 1909. Its territorial neighbor, New Mexico, where Leopold lived most of his Southwest career, was slightly larger at 327,000. To put this new land in perspective, the population of Connecticut, where he had attended Yale, was more than 1 million. Compared to Arizona, Connecticut held 5 times as many people on 1/20th of the land. From Leopold's first base of operations, the closest towns of any size were Phoenix and Albuquerque, with both about 11,000 people, more than 200 miles away. His new world differed from the East in one significant way: space. When the untried forester stepped into that immense space on July 16, 1909, he would not have seen a single automobile, a paved road, or a substantial building. He would have seen Native Americans at the depot selling crafts. More than a few faces would have reflected their Mexican heritage. Intermarriage was common, as Leopold himself would attest. He was not in Burlington or New Haven anymore. As part of a team he supervised, Leopold might spend weeks riding across Apache National Forest's majestic mountains and plateaus. "I am lucky to be here in advance of the big works," he wrote. "I wouldn't trade it for anything else under the sun." The majesty of that place extended beyond natural landscapes to cultural vistas. And when Leopold arrived, the area's Indian populations in particular were undergoing tremendous change, political upheavals that continued throughout his 15 years in the Southwest. Importantly, the resilience that Indian people demonstrated in the face of these crises was grounded in a personal, not an economic, relationship to the land. That personal connection wasn't part of Leopold's Yale curriculum, but he eventually learned it, felt it, embraced it, and left beautiful words to describe it. Now, a bit of background. While skirmishes continued into the 20th century, the 1930s actually, for the most part, the Indian Wars ended in 1886 with Geronimo's surrender to General Crook, followed by the Apache leader's deportation to Florida and his death in 1909, the year Leopold first set foot on the mesas that Apaches had wandered across since the 15th century. If there was any question as to who won the Indian Wars, the answer came at Wounded Knee in 1890, the date Frederick Jackson Turner signaled out importantly, eloquently, but mistakenly, as the year the frontier ended. The young historian, only 31 at the time, and later actually one of Leopold's neighbors in Madison, presented his influential thesis at the 1893 Columbian Exhibition in Chicago, where each day thousands of fairgoers, including the Leopold family from Iowa, marveled at the White City's electric lights, colossal exhibit halls, newfangled Ferris wheel, and Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, the crowds cheering a proxy Sitting Bull as he reenacted Custer's Montana stand. The actual leader of the Lakota Sioux was not available. During his months with Cody's show in 1885-86, the aging Sitting Bull met dignitaries, filled arenas, and posed for photographs. Such was his fame. Then he went home to South Dakota and was shot in the head by Indian agents in 1890, Turner's frontier closing date. Sitting Bull's death was a closing, but not the one identified in Turner's thesis, a thinly disguised tribute to the march of civilization to manifest destiny. Instead, Sitting Bull's murder marked the passing of a way of life, not progress. By the time of his death, many Indians lived close to the edge of real danger, wrote Wallace Stegner, who, like Leopold, was born in Iowa, then raised in Indian country. Born in 1909, when Aldo arrived in the Southwest, Stegner grew up among a wounded people and a wounded land. Like others, he found purpose in Leopold's conviction that Americans must reorient their values. What he told us was that our minds have to change, that a revolution in our thinking must take place. Following Leopold's lead, Stegner found teachers close at hand. We might well consider learning more from the Indian than trying to make a white man of him. When Leopold arrived in Holbrook, many Southwest reservations had been established. It's the red marks, red areas on the map, including the Navajo, Hopi, Hualapai, Havasupai, and most Pueblo tribes in New Mexico. By 1924, when he left the Southwest, Arizona had added the huge Tohono-O'odham Reservation along the border, among others, totaling 19 nations. Next door, New Mexico contained more than 20 smaller reservations. In Arizona and in New Mexico, Aldo Leopold lived in the middle of Indian country. The famous Taos Pueblo was not far from the home that he and Estella built. From their residences in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, Pueblo communities were within a short ride, and many public lands Leopold inspected adjoined tribal territory. Much of what he saw was devastating. The late author Michael Doris said, quote, "There has never been a greater misnomer than to call Indians the vanishing Americans," end quote. But earlier, knowledgeable and sympathetic voices, including Leopold's, wondered if indigenous cultures would survive. They had reason to think so. Depending upon whose figures one accepts, by 1900, between 65 and 99% of Native peoples had been wiped out since contact. The loss of life from war and disease slowed as the 20th century began, but other losses continued during Leopold's time in the Southwest. Considering that 2/3 of Indian land in 1887 was in the hands of non-natives by 1934, he obviously witnessed the unrelenting theft of Indian soil. Still, while Leopold's Southwest years represented a low point for many tribes, the era also saw the dawn of self-determination. When he arrived, the routine of removal, long march, and relocation had almost ended. And by the time Leopold departs the Southwest in 1924, most tribal nations had settled on land they would never leave. Tribes also began to form governments somewhat independent of federal oversight. Boarding schools were being closed, while medical centers, social agencies, and economic development programs took place on Indian land. These achievements do not mask the inequities in education, employment, and healthcare that continued on the reservations, often becoming worse as federal assimilation and termination policies swung in and out of political favor. To be clear, early 20th century reservations were among the most desperate places in the country, fixed in neglect and voicelessness. Upon his arrival in 1909, Leopold would have learned that the first inhabitants of Arizona and New Mexico were not citizens in the eyes of the federal government, a designation they would not receive until 1924, the year Leopold left the Southwest. The original Americans would not be granted the right to vote in either state until 1948, the year Aldo died. Given the turmoil occurring on Indian land during Leopold's time in the Southwest, it is unlikely that someone of his curious nature in his profession would not have engaged the controversies, especially because the disputes and the laws and the treaties and the dispossessions concerned land and culture and politics, three topics that consumed Leopold. By the time he left for Wisconsin, he had spent nearly 15 years wandering through, studying, and writing about a natural and cultural environment very different from his native Iowa. That sense of place where indigenous and Hispanic traditions still influenced land policy and society itself would have a subtle but ultimately profound effect on Leopold's evolution as a conservationist. It is no exaggeration to suggest that the culmination of Leopold's intellectual journey, his celebrated land ethic, had its genesis in the Southwest. Granted, when he left for Wisconsin, he wasn't close to articulating his famous statement, but he had taken steps in that direction, questioning, for example, policies concerning fire, sustained yield, road building, predator control, and the value of wilderness. He had also begun to speak about land health in terms that stressed ecological and moral obligations. The result, says his biographer Kurt Miney, quote, was a series of articles and speeches noteworthy for ecological insights decades ahead of their time. These insights also reflect, among other things, his growing appreciation of indigenous values. 5 races, 5 cultures have flourished here, he writes. We may truthfully say of our 4 predecessors that they left the earth alive, undamaged. As historian Roderick Nash says, Leopold's achievements rested on more than a century of theological, philosophical, and scientific thought. Nash and others have traced many influences, including Leopold's use of Charles Darwin's science and Peter Ouspensky's philosophy, his embrace of nature writers like Thoreau and Muir, or novelists like Sinclair Lewis. Less has been written, however, about the influences of Native and Mexican Americans on Leopold, even though their cultural environment surrounded him professionally and personally. For instance, in 1912, Leopold married into a prosperous Hispanic family. His new in-laws managed one of the largest sheep ranches in the country, a business traceable to the early 1800s. His marriage to the striking 22-year-old Estella Bergeret introduced Aldo not only to a new language, religion, and cuisine, but also to another way of thinking about natural resources, especially water rights and grazing practices. Also, the time in the Southwest, the couple's time in the Southwest, was the heyday of the Taos artist colony. Paintings by Blumenschein, stories by Cather and Austin, often with Indian, Mexican, and environmental themes. Other artists like D.H. Lawrence stayed at Mabel Dodd Lujan's Taos Salon, only 30 miles from the Leopold's cabin. A young Robert Oppenheimer spent summers nearby, returning often, later to build a device. Aldo and Estella were well suited to this bohemian setting. They loved opera and the theater, joined literary salons, and read voraciously. Unfortunately, I can find no evidence that Leopold and a young Oppenheimer ever had a discussion about ethics. I think that would be interesting. The period also saw the dawn of tourism in the West, with Fred Harvey marketing exotic landscapes and native cultures, and Santa Fe Railroad happy to sponsor the travel to the Grand Canyon and other majestic spots. It was a development not lost on Leopold, who in 1917 and 18 was director of the Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce, an odd and short-lived career move, but it's where he encouraged tourism that celebrated the region's distinctive heritage. I see Leopold as a practitioner of what today we'd call cultural tourism, heritage tourism, ecotourism, even though that lexicon did not exist until the 1980s. Contributing to that touristic appeal, linguists, archaeologists, and other adventurers and scientists like John Wesley Powell had discovered and promoted Indian cultures. Alongside photographers like Edward Curtis, these scholars helped ignite an explosion of interest in native customs, languages, and crafts. Leopold worked in the middle of this. Most importantly, the battles over land that he witnessed often involved tribal territory, where the disputes were as much cultural as geographical, about the land's sacred purpose, not its economic potential. These debates continue today, of course, whether it's mining on sacred Apache land here in Arizona or building border walls across the tribe's burial sites. The early 20th century controversies would have been familiar to many in the Southwest, since by Leopold's time, land was the economy. Moreover, as head of public relations for his district, churning out newsletters about land issues, Leopold operated at the center of political and environmental and cultural conflicts over land. He could not have failed to recognize the clash of values embedded in these battles. Among them, the establishment of Grand Canyon, first a national monument in 1908, then a national park in 1919, requiring the relocation of Havasupai Indians. Importantly, Leopold wrote the park's first master plan in 1915. Also, the Chiricahua returned in 1913. After nearly 20 years, they were relocated to Oklahoma in 1894. Carlos Montezuma's activism, speaking, lobbying, starting a newspaper in 1916. The Yavapai Apache earning a reputation as a troublemaker among authorities. Amendments to the Dawes Act and implementation of the Newlands Act. Dawes tried to turn natives into yeoman farmers, while Newlands created massive irrigation projects in the West that often drowned Indian land. And dozens of other events and controversies and laws, such as the hugely important 1922 Colorado River Compact, signed near Santa Fe, which was not overly concerned with Indian rights. At their core, many disputes highlighted cultural differences over concepts like ownership and best use. Like other government officials, Leopold had trained and worked in what he calls an age of engineers, a world of print and grids, a linear universe answerable to cause and effect, managed by overconfident experts. Indigenous worldviews, by contrast, were oral, obscure to outsiders, humble in nature's shadow, holistic rather than causal, what the late Laguna writer Polygon Allen calls the sacred hoop. Early on, Leopold's comments tend to reflect standard agency practice, viewing natives as obstacles to well-ordered landscapes, and some of his words are indeed cringeworthy. Quote, "The only hunting I've done this month is for Indians, but the SOBs got away from us," he complains in a 1909 letter, ignoring the fact that until recently, his forest was their home. While crafting plans for the Grand Canyon in 1915, he wonders, it's quite a question about how to handle the Supai Indians, again, dismissing the tribe's historic bond to the deep gorge. However, always responsive to his cultural surroundings, which weave their way through his letters and journals and essays, Leopold eventually begins to speak a different language. He grows, he evolves. As Julianne Newton observes about his final years in the Southwest, cultural expressions, the point of contention in many land use disputes, elbow their way into Leopold's thinking. Once again, determining and bringing about the desired end would involve cultural as well as ecological insights. The Odyssey Julianne traces is a combination of Leopold's training at Yale, on-the-ground research, and extensive reading, all wrapped in a Southwest heritage that was expressed at least partially through an indigenous outlook, unwritten at the time, but discernible through the integration of land and culture. Leopold's journey will eventually incorporate this understanding. He had begun to invoke the spiritual imperatives that characterize indigenous views. In a 1923 article, he includes a section titled Conservation as a Moral Issue. In 1924, his last year in the Southwest, he writes, "We are crushing the last remnants of something that ought to be preserved for our spiritual welfare." Leopold has approached the mountain and the wolf, hoping to be included in their dialogue. Then he and the family leave for a very different environment in 1924 to Madison, Wisconsin, where he had accepted the position as deputy director of the university's Forest Products Lab. In Wisconsin, home of his hero, John Muir, Leopold's Southwest education is reinforced, the result of a frustrating job, economic worries, ecological failures, looming wars, and close to home, a barren landscape absent the indigenous voices he had begun listening to. By 1848, when it became a state, Wisconsin had rid itself of many Indian lands and most native forests, a correlation that does not escape Leopold. Quote, "Most of the original inhabitants have been run out of Wisconsin." He continues, "This applies not only to Indians, but also to grasses, forests, shrubs, and in part to trees." In his new surroundings, where he would spend 24 years as an administrator, consultant, and professor, Leopold saw more clearly the connection between land and culture. Of no small consequence was the Depression. Less than a year before the 1929 stock market crash, not a wise career move on his part, Aldo left the Forest Products Lab, exasperated with the job. For the next 5 years, before he secured a position at the University of Wisconsin, he hung out his consulting forester shingle, hoping to provide for a large family and a new house during the Depression's darkest years, a job that kept him constantly on the road, mostly in the Midwest. At the same time, the 1930s economic and agricultural disasters tested the nation's faith in the science that Pinchot and other progressives had championed. The Southwest had chipped away at Leopold's confidence, and now, by way of extensive research he undertook, Leopold experienced firsthand many ecological disasters engineered by college-trained experts. The Dust Bowl tested his faith in what he called technological clean farming. The drought, erosion, and vanished topsoil that shocked the nation's heartland, he chalked up to the industrialization of agriculture, saying simply, "Our tools are better than we are. We lack the wisdom to use them correctly." Leopold knew that the Hopi in northeastern Arizona grew corn on a rock without much water sustainably for years. Yet modern scientific agriculture had turned the heartland into dust in a few decades. A 3-month trip to Germany in 1935, where Leopold saw managed but artificial landscapes, what he called cubist forestry, left him feeling that foresters trained solely in economics did not fully appreciate land health, which he characterized by diversity, not monocultures. On that trip, where the Nazis exterminated the weeds in the forest and the weeds in society, the Jews, the artists, the homosexuals. Leopold further connected the environment and the greater good, realizing that our treatment of the land parallels our treatment of people. Sitting in a Berlin hotel, he jotted on a napkin that those who study the human community and the natural community are barely aware of one another. Quote, the inevitable fusion of these two lines of thought will perhaps constitute the outstanding advance of the present century, end quote. At war's end, with Germany's forests coloring his thoughts, a troubled Leopold feels this fusion has not been realized. Again, he knew Indian peoples lacked impressive scientific research and textbooks, but they possessed the wisdom to live with and work on the land without destroying it. Equally significant were trips to Mexico in the mid-30s to land that was still worked by native peoples, but which nonetheless appeared healthier than the territories he administered. It was here, he says, I first realized that land is an organism and that all my life I had seen only sick land, whereas here was a biota still in perfect aboriginal health. Sitting at the Gavilan River's edge, Leopold weighed this perfect wilderness against the exhausted lands in his custody. He muses that possibly someone earlier had a better idea. There once were men capable of inhabiting a river without disrupting the harmony of its life. Perhaps the most significant episodes occurred on Leopold's own land. Whoops, sorry. In 1935, he bought 80 sickly acres, 50 miles north of Madison, the site of his celebrated shack, where he, Estella, 5 children, and his students experimented with working landscapes until Aldo died there in 1948. The weekend trips to the shack also brought him into contact with other landowners, and cultivating a conservation ethic among the public became a cause. Leopold established land cooperatives, wrote a column for the state's wildlife magazine, spoke at many civic events, broadcast a regular radio show, and was embedded in politics, both legislative and grassroots. He rightfully perceived that more land is held privately than by public agencies. So if we are to restore land health, something other than government incentives is necessary, something that appealed to the public's heart, not only its pocketbook. Quote, there must be some force behind conservation, more universal than profit, he wrote. I can see only one such force, a sense of love and obligation. Today, thousands of people continue to visit the shack and a nearby heritage center to celebrate that personal connection to land. What drew Leopold to love and obligation as the central organizing principle? Other families owned farms, friends went with him to Mexico, others traveled to Germany, and nearly everybody knew of the Dust Bowl. But they didn't write the conservation ethic in 1933 or the farmer as conservationist in 1939, 2 essays that bookend an important phase of his development. The 1933 essay, which reappears in a Sand County Almanac, introduces a new theme, calling for philosophers to extend moral considerability beyond humans. The later essay, in the wake of a tempest of topsoil in the nation's Midwest and anemic forests in Germany, breaks with Pinchot. What spurs the creative turning point of the 30s? Searching for answers to the human land riddle, Leopold frequently channels his thoughts and experiences through his profession's research. Increasingly, he invokes cultural lenses, Eastern literature, transcendentalism, Russian mysticism, Western philosophy, European philosophy, arts, and poetry. He is apt to cite Shakespeare as Darwin. In time, Leopold reaches back to the expressions of another place, especially as he worked on the game management book and traveled widely inspecting farms and forests. I submit that he began to reflect on the cultural topography of his first assignment in the Southwest. The tumultuous 30s, when more than a few progressive certainties had been toppled, provided an opening for indigenous values to resurface, shaping and reinforcing other lessons. A noticeable outcome is that his later comments about Native Americans honor their values. A 1943 essay, Wilderness in American Culture, for example, celebrates the Indians' reverence for the buffalo, a sustainer of both life and spirit. Elsewhere, his words seem tinged with regret for shutting down rather than listening to an entire culture. We spoke harshly of the Spaniards, who in their zeal for gold and converts had needlessly extinguished the native Indians. It did not occur to us that we too were the captains of an invasion too sure of its righteousness. A humbled Leopold, his confidences shattered more than once, accepts that unfathomable meaning, aware that the hillside is ordered by unknown controls too complex to manage. Rather than attempt to fix nature, Leopold realizes he can and should learn from it. Over time, the slow fusion within him spawns an ethic that is, in part, a Western interpretation of indigenous land practices, made understandable and palatable to a dominant culture steeped in progress, boosterism, and scientific certainty. Given his time, it's unlikely Leopold could stand before an audience of land managers and declare, "We came from the earth, our mother," as did a Nez Perce prophet. But that is precisely what his land ethic proposes, a community nurtured by indigenous cultures and framed by a new ecological understanding. While some find his statement muddled or sentimental, this overlooks the defining feature of the land ethic, which is that our relationship to nature must be based on something other than use. It is a quality that follows directly from Native American views, where land was seldom valued as a commodity to be surveyed, fenced, or purchased. So while it's impossible to identify the Native American doctrine that influenced Leopold, just as there's no single Euro-American view, we can point to a few threads that weave their way through the tapestry of many Aboriginal beliefs. Among them, reciprocity and respect define the bond between all members of the land community. This relationship is a cultural bond shaped by something other than profit. To speak of an individual owning land is akin to a person owning, to somebody owning a person, akin to slavery. Communally, nature plays a role in religious ceremonies, hunting rituals, arts and crafts, government, agriculture, and other day-to-day practices. And finally, each generation has a responsibility to leave a healthy world to future generations. These are not romantic, noble savage fables. The millions of indigenous peoples in the Americas before European contact, probably between 20 and 100 million people, used natural resources, built cities, diverted waterways, exploited animals, exterminated species, and transformed ecosystems. Complicating the interpretation, the continent was home to dozens of nations, most with multiple clans and villages. So to say all Indian people in all places followed the same ecological blueprint is a non-starter. Having said that, more than 13 years of history suggest the prevailing standards shaping indigenous relationships to the natural world were restraint and reverence. Restraint because as people close to the land, they embraced their dependence on Earth's resources, a view Leopold adopts. Reverence because all was a gift from the Creator, whose reincarnated universe meant that animals and trees and rocks were another people. Dene farmers call maize corn people, singing to each plant as they might a child. Considering American Indians' hunting skills, they probably could have wiped out the buffalo, but they didn't, an act of ecological restraint and spiritual reverence. Had they practiced farming more intensely on the Southwest fragile soil, they could have destroyed their world, but most didn't. Historian Donald Hughes writes, Indian technology was certainly capable of doing more damage to the environment than was actually done, end quote. It wasn't so much the available tools that determined land health, it was instead the wisdom to know what to do with them, a theme Leopold adopts. Quote, our tools suffice to crack the atom, to command the tides, but they do not suffice for the oldest task in human history, to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. Among indigenous belief systems which reflect this conviction, the Iroquois Confederacy Constitution, a 500-year-old charter first recorded in the 19th century, decrees that human actions should account for families 7 generations beyond. Quote, the thickness of your skin shall be 7 spans. Look and listen for the welfare of the whole people and have always in view not only the present, but also the coming generations, end quote. In effect, the Iroquois outline a sustainable world. And while sustainability today has become a trendy and sometimes hollow buzzword, it was a theme for Leopold. Although he never uses the word in today's sense, many of his comments express sustainable ambitions. Rather than sustainability, he is apt to use stability or permanence or harmony. The true problem, he says, is to achieve both utility and beauty, and thus permanence. If anyone understood that formula, Leopold comes to appreciate, it was the cultures who had lived on, worked on, sustained themselves, and learned from the hair trigger ecology of the Southwest. So what indigenous views eventually show up in Leopold's ethic? I'll end with this 10-point outline. I'm not going to go through it all, but it's an account of his land ethic. That is the 10 characteristics of the land ethic. Pairing Leopold's words with those from Native Americans, both early and modern, may help start a conversation about the ways his views reflect indigenous thought, and hopefully encourage more research in this area. While the tones and textures of the passages differ, the meanings do not. I'll not read all of these examples, but just introduce each of the characteristics. First, the land. When he refers to the land, Leopold means all of its parts. And here you see 2 representative statements from Leopold and an early 20th century Hopi Indian. By structure, Leopold maintains that humans are part of this drama, not outside of it in some dualistic pattern, and certainly not at the top of a hierarchical system, as both Leopold and Black Elk maintain here. Design, Leopold suggests that this ecosystem is not an inert, predictable mechanism as Bacon and Descartes imagined, but a holistic, chaotic energy force too complex to comprehend. This, the flux of nature, rather than the traditional balance of nature. You can see Linda Hogan's last line there. It's an intelligence far-reaching and beyond our comprehension. Preservation, because of the nature of nature's complexity and the billions of years of evolutionary commotion it took to form the land community, Leopold believes all of its parts are valuable and worthy of protection, as he and Chief Seattle both say. Responsibility, Leopold recognizes that humans can affect the organism more than any other species, and therefore they occupy a position of both privilege and accountability. Love. Our pact with nature should not be governed by the tools that define the apex of civilization since the 17th century, namely science and economics. Leopold believes their exalted standing is part of the problem, and instead humankind's link to the world, to the natural world, must be grounded as well in ethics, aesthetics, and reverence. Character. Our relationship to the natural world reflects and molds the American character, our identity, our democratic principles. Leopold authored essays with titles like Land Use and Democracy, while other articles discuss hunting and husbandry as vital to democracy, a thesis made popular by his neighbor in Wisconsin, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner. Diversity. Importantly, nature's resilience is a function of biotic diversity. A monoculture undermines land health and threatens sustainability. Instruction. The land ethic must be properly cultivated. In schools and communities, it will be realized when citizens develop a personal, not only a professional and economic commitment to the land. Since ecology embodies interrelationships, its practice must be taught as something other than a menu of separate courses or programs that are isolated from the broader land narrative. Finally, purpose. Why do we do this? The land ethic is more than a tool to preserve natural resources and critters. It is instead a means to a greater social good. As Leopold saw in Germany, the way we treat the land speaks volumes about the way we treat one another. Let's look at these final two comments. Leopold's to change ideas about what land is for is to change ideas about what anything is for, follows directly from the Germany trip. Leslie Silko, I'm going to read the whole thing here. The snow-covered mountain remained without regard to titles or ownership or the white ranchers who thought they possessed it. They logged the trees, they killed the deer, bear, and mountain lions. They built their fences high, but the mountain was far greater than any or all of these things. The mountain outdistanced their destruction, just as love had outdistanced death. The mountain could not be lost to them because it was in their bones. The mountain was in the native people's bones, regardless of white man's assault. At the end of Silko's novel, Ceremony, her character, Teo, experiences an epiphany, an understanding of the universe's wholeness. Like Leopold, he learns from mountain thinking. As these native voices reveal, there's little new in Leopold's important line of thought. Emerson found similar views in Eastern literature, and when Thoreau or Mary Austin talk about, quote, native Indian wisdom, they pay tribute to the same idea. To that time-honored ethic, Leopold skillfully adds ecology, updating and reconfirming scientifically what earlier cultures revered spiritually. Like Thoreau, who died relatively unknown outside of Concord, Leopold was not well known outside forestry circles when he died in 1948, and the Sand County Almanac sold only modestly when released a year later. Both men stood outside their time. Thoreau wrote as the Industrial Revolution was about to anoint technology a god, and Leopold's final thoughts were stifled by a post-World War II science mania that favored rationalism over his love and obligation. Still, just as it took Leopold decades to decipher indigenous values, a new generation in the 60s and 70s, weary of social convention, eventually grasped the largely unplumbed implications of his poetry, and ultimately, like Walden, Sand County Almanac became required reading in the curriculum. Oh, I just lost something here, hold on. It became one of the Bibles of environmental, even though it eludes direct application. But that misses the point. Leopold's book is an inquiry, not a how-to manual. Wallace Stegner said, it's not a fact, but a task meant to question our values, not prescribe rules. Leopold says, quote, no important change in ethics was ever accomplished without an internal change in our intellectual emphases, loyalties, affections, and convictions. These convictions stem from a deep knowledge of one's place. We can be ethical only in relation to something we can see, feel, and understand, he wrote. And by understand, he means the land's grand narrative, which explains why he taught ecology as a story. I am trying to teach you, he told students, that this alphabet of natural objects may be read. Native Americans held similar views, seeing the world, says Luther Standing Bear, as a library and its books are stones and leaves and grass. Leopold uses the same metaphor. Thus, he who owns a veteran burr owns more than a tree. He owns a historical library. The land narrative also includes a human chapter. The landscape of any farm is the owner's portrait of himself, he says. To appreciate that connection, then, land literacy, like reading the printed page, should be taught, because doing so, as Leopold writes, will, quote, yield not only pleasure, but wisdom. Leopold sought that wisdom his whole life, in classrooms, mountains, books, civic activism. It's a journey he would describe, but not live to read. He suffered a fatal heart attack while fighting a grass fire near the shack on April 21st, 1948, 73 years ago yesterday. He died just 1 week after learning that his essays had been accepted for publication by Oxford University Press. Aldo Leopold never saw his final words in print, nor did he have any idea how a Sand County Almanac would be regarded, selling millions of copies in dozens of languages, launching university programs and conservation agencies, and encouraging countless admirers to change careers, to change themselves, really, because ultimately Leopold is not about shaping landscapes, but shaping values. Conservation is a tool to do that. One reason the book endures is precisely because of this larger purpose, which was questioned by publishers who expected another nature book about trees and birds. In what turned out to be the book's most important passages, Leopold admonishes our hubris and suggests that the achievements we take such pride in, namely technological and economic advances, are fine, but they're only tools that produce more tools. Quote, we are remodeling Alhambra with a steam shovel, and we are proud of our yardage, he writes. Sadly, steam shovels are simply a means to an end. They don't tell society what a desirable end is. The depressing result is a landscape shaped by means, not end, by tools, not wisdom. To prevent that, Leopold urges, we should listen to the mountain, to the wolf, and their partners in the soil. And we have mentors long here who can teach us how to do that. If we learn from them and train our ecological ear just right, the land may whisper and we may hear the unfathomable meaning. Then you may hear it, a vast pulsing harmony, the score inscribed on 1,000 hills, its notes, the lives and deaths of plants and animals, its rhythms spanning the seconds and centuries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. We'll take some questions in the chat. If anyone would like to put questions in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask Dan a question yourself. There's some comments in the chat. Awesome presentation, Dan. Thank you. Did you have a question on the iPhone?
Yeah, Dan, hi. This is John Moore here. Excellent program, really excellent program. I really liked the connection you made with Turner's Closing of the Frontier, because it seems like what America did at that time frame was we decided the frontier was closed and we looked outwards towards the world and went that direction, and we stopped looking at our world.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that there could be a great deal more research done on Turner and Leopold, especially because, as I mentioned, Turner ended up being his neighbor, and he was old by then, but
Yeah.
he ended up being his neighbor there in Madison when, yeah. Yeah, the 1890 thesis, there's a lot on it now that, people taking Turner to task for saying, well, the, frontier's closed, et cetera. No. But what Leopold took from Turner, I think, was the notion that the land shapes us. And that's all through Turner. That the American character is shaped by the land. We are reflections of our land. And that certainly shows up a lot in Leopold.
Yeah, excellent.
Thanks for your nice comments.
There's a couple of comments in the chat. Thank you, Dan. Very good. A great in-depth venture into Leopold and his influences. Really appreciate all of the Native American connections. Another patron wrote, phenomenal presentation, visionary. We'll do more reading about Leopold. Wonder what he would say today.
Yeah, that you get that question a lot. What would Leopold think about XYZ today? One person I did not mention that I should probably have in the presentation is the Native American writer Scott Momaday, and Scott actually has an essay on the land ethic. So again, he sees the parallels between the Native appreciation of land and where Leopold eventually ends up.
Someone would like to know, what grade would you give today's efforts to educate, rediscover, and implement a healthier approach to the earth?
What grade would I give?
Mm-hmm.
It would be, yeah. I don't know. If you're talking about in schools, it would be a pretty low grade. But with activities like, what's going on at Prospect with your organization, there's so many like little Leopold-like organizations popping up here in Arizona. Well, New Mexico, the Quivira Coalition, again, they take his ideas and, they work with farmers and landowners all over New Mexico. Here in Arizona, we have a group called the Malpais Borderlands Group. And they're similar. They're taking Leopold's notion that, use and preservation must intersect, but we can do it sustainably, we can do it appropriately. But we have, as you may know, here in Arizona, we have tremendous problems with, I did mention the mining on Apache land, that's still going on. The border wall down on the Tohono O'odham Reservation, they're building the wall right across burial land, which is stopped now. But yeah.
Somebody wants to know if the recording will be available. It'll be available all next week. You can just check our calendar and sign up for the recording. Another patron said, I'm new to this subject and finding it to be so interesting. Living in a suburb of Chicago on a small lot, not sure how to go about changing my tiny landscape to be more aligned to the land ethic. What ideas could you share?
You may look for, as I mentioned, there are like little Leopold projects bubbling up all over, and they're not confined to the wilderness or to, places like where he's sitting there on that rock. There are wonderful things going on in downtown Chicago. You might want to look for the PBS documentary about Leopold. It's called Green Fire. I think you can watch it on YouTube. And I know in that program, they do visit a Chicago-based downtown sort of ecological ecological program, that brings in children. and teaches them that no, eggs really come from chickens, not from Safeway and that sort of thing. But yeah, these are not, well, and your own work there too at Prospect Heights. But I would encourage you to look for it's called Green Fire. It's about 10 years old now. But I believe it's available. It's a 60-minute documentary. And by the way, in that documentary, while they were filming the documentary is when they discovered where he shot the wolf. So when they started making the documentary, they didn't have that in mind. And right at the very end is when a letter emerged in 2009 that pinpointed where he shot the wolf. And they added that onto the documentary at the very end, and they go to the site. And I've been to the site. We go to the site and read Sand County Almanac, and then hike down. It's not an easy hike.
Right, another patron commented, "Bravo, such a well-written and illustrated presentation. Thank you. Thank you for such a valuable presentation." Someone is saying, "Come to the PHNRC workday. Anybody can volunteer for the work days and learn firsthand how to implement the land ethic at home and in your neighborhood." I'll be sending out an email with the link to sign up for the recording. And in there, I will also link to the PHNRC website, and you can sign up for their journal, and they will send you emails and remind you where their work day is and what time, etc. They're always looking for more volunteers. If anybody has any more questions, feel free to unmute, or you can put it in your chat. We'll give it a few more minutes. I did hear from Dana, one of the Prospect Heights Natural Resource Commissioners, that one positive thing out of the pandemic is they're getting twice as many volunteers out there to help them, but they're always looking for more help. They're getting a lot of high schoolers, because high schoolers, many of them want to do service hours. And I know at our library, we haven't had the ability to take in any high school volunteers. So this is a perfect match for them to go out and help out and learn about the environment. It's a wonderful, positive outcome of the situation. Someone is referring in the chat to the organization called the wildones.org. Wild Ones is an organization healing the earth 1 yard at a time with native plants. So that would be a resource for the person that asked about how to implement that in your own yard. So that's wildones.org. All righty, one more minute. I'm going to give anybody that wants to unmute. Feel free to unmute. As a reminder, I'm letting you know that the recording for this program will be available starting on Monday through the following Friday. And you can sign up on our event calendar, our old event calendar, for that recording. And I will be sending everyone a follow-up email with the link to sign up for that, as well as information about the PHNRC and about the Nature Speaks coming in June.
I would just say, Terry, that the June talk, I think you have Stan Temple.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, Stan is one of the giants of Aldo Leopold research. I know his talk's not specifically on Leopold, but yeah, he's been at this for a long time, so don't miss that one.
Great, that's great to hear. And You'll be able to sign up for that fairly soon, once we get our new event calendar going next week. Another comment here is applause, applause. Thank you, Dan. And with that, we're going to say good evening. I know it's almost evening there, probably. So thank you very, very much for a wonderful presentation. Everybody stay well. We hope to see you all at a program very soon. Thank you again, Dan.
Thank you. Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day.